I should think not.
Miles in
Right.
Town, 2011.
Right, Anne. Well, the first thing to say, thank you very much for doing this. This is
You're
very
very
kind of
welcome.
you.
My pleasure.
So the first couple of questions I've got for you really are about putting career learning and development in a context.
Yeah.
So I guess my first one is, what is career learning and how does it relate to one-to-one career practice?
Okay, well, career learning for me is learning what you need to do in order to access guidance, or in order to be able to progress with your plans and maintain a successful longitudinal career path, I suppose. You just in the same way as to pass a maths exam, you have to have some basic knowledge in order to be able to get over that hurdle. To me, career learning is to enable people, whether they're young people in school or university or adults in fact, to gain those skills, personal skills that they need, but also to gain the knowledge that they need to get over the hurdles in their own careers.
So it's the knowledge that they need in order to make the career decisions?
Partly that, but also to maintain a career. To be able to
manage their careers.
To manage, yes. I mean, essentially, if you think about, for example, the CASV cycle, which you may have touched on, you're teaching people a protocol for career decision making.
Yeah.
And that's part of career learning. Learning how I do this. So knowing enough about myself, knowing enough about the context for these decisions, and having longer term ideas, but having the confidence to be able to be flexible within those with those ideas. So yes, knowledge, skills, but also approach, attitude about the fact that this is my career, this is my responsibility. It's not just about deciding what I'm going to be when I grow up or when I want to leave university, but in a much more complex setting. How am I going to manage this thing that we call career within the context of my whole life?
So then why would you need a one-to-one on top of that? Would you need, maybe you wouldn't. Would you need a one-to-one?
I've often made the point that certainly with younger people in schools, for example, if they have a really good career learning programme, they may not need one-to-one.
So it almost could be, it's just a different medium.
It could be, but I think the approach that says that if you know what you want to be, you don't need a one-to-one session is also flawed, because you may think you know what you want to do and be, and that may need some challenge. So I think a good programme can, to some extent, ameliorate the need for one-to-one work. But not necessarily. It may well be that I know all this stuff, I understand myself, or I understand what I don't know about myself, I understand what I need to know, and I need some support to help me to think that through. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need it, but certainly the provision of one-to-one support without career learning leads you down a very sticky path, I think.
Go on.
Well, essentially, I think a lot of practitioners would agree that without career learning, what you're then doing in a one-to-one session is trying to do all that career learning in a session, trying to understand the person, trying to help them to work out what their opportunities are, and then trying to help them make some plans, all in that one session, which is,
just not realistic.
Not feasible. Not to do well, anyway.
No. Okay. So that's about the sort of the learning and the one-to-ones. Now, another area I'm really interested in is how career learning and career learning frameworks relate to career theories.
Right. Well, I'm not sure there's an answer to that.
No, there may not be.
I think there are a number of terms that need unpacking here. Career theory is one term.
Yeah.
Career frameworks, career learning frameworks is another term. Career learning generally, we've been talking about. And people will define those things in different ways. So some things that some people would call theory can be a framework, and that the most obvious one would be the DOTS framework.
Yeah.
But it is also a theory. It is also a developmental theory, isn't it?
Right.
And you know, well-known theories like Donald Super's work, also gives you a framework to work with. So I don't think the two are completely separate.
So it's a bit of an artificial distinction I'm making.
I think it can be, because if you've got a framework, in other words, a structure around which you would build provision or practice, then that's based on some assumptions. It's based on some understanding, which comes from some kind of theoretical ideas anyway. So I don't think the distinction is completely clear. However, there are some things that are very much theoretical, on which you may build some sort of structure, but stand as theories in themselves. So, for example, Ken Roberts' ideas about opportunity structures, that's a theory, isn't it? It's a sociological theory. However, that does advise us that we need to make sure that young people are treated equally, that they're given every opportunity, irrespective of the background, etc., etc. So it informs practice, it informs framework, but is theoretical in itself. So I think there are those links.
You could see a framework as being a mechanism to translate the theory into practice.
Yes, I think so.
Or you could see it, depending on the particular things you're talking about, you could see it as more of a continuum, or actually a framework could be a theory.
Yes, I mean, I think certainly a framework is a way of linking theory with how to do it. As we were talking earlier, I think it's also fair to say that frameworks are also a way of trying to control what goes on. So, for example, Ofsted love frameworks, don't they? Because they can go into a school or a college and say, you know, have you ticked all these boxes? You know, where's your bit about that? And I can see you've got a lesson on that, so we can tick that off. So it's a way of evaluating. Without a framework, it's difficult to make judgments. So it's a very useful tool from the outside looking in.
A sort of quality control.
Yeah, I think, you know, without being too cynical, I think that they can be used for that, and clearly are. From the inside looking out, however, I think it would be almost impossible to develop any kind of provision that it absolutely ticks every box of a framework, because that's not how learning goes on in institutions, is it? You have to fit in around other things, and I'm personally very keen on learning not being silo-ised. I know that's not a word, but
we know what you mean.
You know, I often think young people, whether they're in a college setting or in a university setting, compartmentalise their learning far too much. And in the world of work, learning doesn't happen like that. Work doesn't happen like that. Career learning ought to be a thread that goes through all of those things. And I think frameworks, in a sense, can encourage people to again find a little slot. This term we're doing self-awareness, so we find a little box for it. Whereas in fact self-awareness should be being drawn out, and that learning being drawn out in all the learning that's going on for those people. I think frameworks can be useful, and they're a very useful way of us thinking about provision. But I think rigorous, tight frameworks that are placed onto provision in an evaluatory way can be, you know, can sometimes miss the point.
So they're most useful when they're sort of helping and giving ideas, rather than when they're controlling and enforcing.
And in fact, I think what was called the ASEG framework, that is very much based on a sort of social constructivist approach, which is and is much more using things like narrative, much more so than the earlier framework, does that. It isn't. It's much more flexible. It's much smaller. You don't have lists and lists of learning outcomes you've got to achieve with this age group. And I think that's helpful.
That works.
It gives you a much broader picture to then see how does this work in our institution.
More effective in practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Can I talk to you about the framework that you taught? I don't know if framework's the right word, but the approach perhaps that you use in your book about career learning and development, which is the essential, foundation and fundamental entitlement.
Yes. Yeah.
So just, I suppose my first question about that is, what made you feel that we needed a new framework?
It's a very good question, because it really, this whole area is so complex. There are so many frameworks and, as you said, theories and structures. My feeling was that we needed something that really distilled all of that and helped a practitioner, which is essentially what that was written for, to say, am I delivering to my learners the things that are going to be most useful for them? And each of those areas, each of those elements of that EFI framework is a very broad description of the sorts of things that learners need to be able to do. They need to be able to make decisions based on impartial information, etc., etc. And rather than list learning outcomes, rather than put one particular theory into a box, the idea of that was to try to distill a number of different frameworks and pull out of them what was most useful. Because as a practitioner, I could see that that I needed something really simple, and just to be able to say, yeah, actually in citizenship, or actually in form time, we do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But maybe we wouldn't in the traditional framework sense be able to tick all those boxes.
Okay, so it's very flexible and can be interpreted in whatever way is going to work.
Absolutely.
So I suppose leading on from that then, what how do you feel it's how do you see it being best used in practice? How does it work when it works well?
The way it seems to be used most effectively is ironically perhaps, because it wasn't what it was intended for, is to evaluate. It seems to be actually quite a useful way of checking, rather than going through, as I said, lists of learning outcomes, etc., to be able to bring together, for example, in a school, which I'm more familiar with than HE, but in a school, to bring together the PSHE coordinator, the citizenship coordinator, the careers person, the person that looks after pastoral care, around a table and say, where do we do this? Or do we do this?
Yeah.
Whereas specific learning outcomes are difficult to identify.
Yeah.
But a much looser structure like EFI, can be used in that way, just to bring that learning together. Because, as I said before, I feel very strongly that career learning, like any kind of personal development learning, ought to transcend subjects and ought to be able to connect learning across the timetable for that young person.
Yes.
So that seems to be where it's most useful. I hope it's also used to help to develop it, but then I suppose evaluation is a process of development, isn't it?
They're not separate,
it's not
are they?
It's not an assessment. So I think that's probably where it's place.
So the book is aimed, and it sounds like most of your sort of area of expertise is with young people, but I mean, to what extent do you think it could translate over to different groups, like with university or career changes?
Yes. I mean, this book is 11 to 19, but actually all career theory transcends age groups. And the theory, if you like, that this book did emerge with was the notion of the bridge model.
Right.
And the bridge model actually is more easily understood in an older student or adult context, because the bridge model is essentially, I'm no engineer, but I believe that sort of suspension bridge only holds up under tension.
Oh.
And it's the tension between the needs of an individual and needs of the economy, the employer. It's the tension between the two things that enables a career to develop. And that's the notion behind that. Now, that's quite a difficult thing to explain to a young person in a school, but it is a model that undergraduates and postgraduates and people working perhaps in a corporate setting, they get it.
Okay.
Because they understand that tension.
Yeah.
And the pillars, what we've sort of labelled things as, are on the one side career happiness, which is a strange word, but it works. You know, how content do I feel? How, to what extent is my career at the moment doing for me what I wanted it to do? And on the other side, the need for career resilience against the demands of employment and the vagaries of employment, the challenges of dealing with redundancy, etc., etc. So that tension between the two works very well. So I think although it is aimed at 11 to 19, particularly that model actually works quite well.
Works quite well.
The older ones, yeah.
Now, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know this is quite influenced by Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, is that what it's called?
Yes.
And I just think it's quite interesting that a lot of the career frameworks that I see don't really incorporate learning theories. And I think it makes a lot of sense that you do, but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how it, the impact it has.
I'm not a Vygotsky expert. It's Dr. Barbara Bassett, of course, who's the expert in that area. But my understanding is that the theory, the model, and the book is based on the idea of social constructivism. So, in other words, constructing one's own understanding of the world around us, but social constructivism being constructing that within a social context. So, learning from each other, not learning on your own. So it supports the notion of group work, group guidance, learning from each other and learning from experiences. The bridge model talks about the narrative, the person's career narrative, being that journey backwards and forwards across that bridge against those two tensions. And that narrative can be defined essentially through ZPD. In other words, I can learn more with your help than I can on my own, and the distance, that proximity of development will vary from person to person to what extent they need support and for how long, and to what extent they can learn from somebody else and then be able to do it on their own. So that's my understanding of how ZPD works, and I think it's odd. I think you're absolutely right, Julia. It's odd that learning is left out of career so much, because that is what career is about. You can't make the decisions that you need to make later on in your career without having learnt earlier on about how a company works or how I felt within that environment. So it is all about learning, and that's something that we've tried to incorporate into that whole approach.
Brilliant. I think that's all I've got to ask you.
Okay.